All right. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky, and in this video, we are going to be discussing the Australopithecines. This is part one of a comprehensive, ongoing series answering the hominin fossil record. And we have a lot to get through, even in part one. And so let's dive right in, as I am excited for you guys to see what we have here on this very important topic, a topic dealing specifically with human ancestry. Now, before we begin, I want to make something very clear about the approach that I'll be taking. Now, at first, because I've been spending a lot of time, countless hours studying this topic in detail, not just examining one or two of the famous Australopithecines like Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, or Ardipithecus ramidus, for example, is another popular hominin, not an Australopithecine, of course, but a so-called intermediate creature that proponents of ape to man evolution like to present as evidence for hominin evolution. And so I will be dealing not just with a couple, but with all of them, including Littlefoot, Australopithecus prometheus. I'll be dealing with Sediba and Amensis. And then as I work through the Australopithecine fossil record, then I will eventually focus on the Homo genus and give good comprehensive explanations for Homo naledi, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo heidelbergensis, for example. So this is going to be a comprehensive series. Now, when it comes to the Australopithecines, there's a fair amount of confusion that I find. And it's not just in the evolutionary community, but also within the creationist world, within our own community, which is why I think this series is so important, as I want to give you guys a go-to series of videos that provides a consistent, that provides a scientifically sound or science rigorous and balanced explanation for the Australopithecines, why they are a separate kind, several kinds, as we're going to see, and not an intermediate or transitional form in the evolutionist sense. And so within the creationist world, there are different groups which seem to overstate their case in opposite directions in dealing with the hominin question. And what that does is it leads to misunderstandings about what these fossils truly represent. It leaves us open to criticisms, and it leaves us open to counter objections from the critics, which is why it's important to engage the critics, to interact with their arguments, to interact with them directly, because this is how we model build. Model building is important. We can refute evolution all day, but we also want to model build and show the superior explanation on these topics. When it comes to the topic of ancestry, I am arguing that separate ancestry or independent origins is the superior explanation. And so what engaging the critics does is it helps us to refine our position. And so credit where credit is due, the model that I am going to be offering, and as far as I can tell, is a novel model in the sense that it answers the bigger picture quite well. You are going to see why the mosaic nature of a lot of these Australopithecines is explained beautifully by the creation model, the biblical model of ancestry. And so critics such as Gutsy Gibbon, who focuses a lot on the topic of hominin fossils and the Australopithecines, watching her lectures, watching her videos has helped me to see which arguments don't work, which points are not that strong, and how our explanation of the hominin fossil record can be refined. And so I am going to be presenting a refined understanding of the Australopithecine fossil record. And so Here's a couple examples of what I mean. Some creationists argue that Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, was simply a quadrupedal chimp-like ape. And what they do is they'll focus too heavily on the early reconstruction issues with her hip, with her pelvis. But today, the problem with that is today we actually have multiple, and informed critics point this out, that we have multiple, much more complete Australopithecine specimens. An example, Littlefoot, or Australopithecus prometheus in technical terms. And these actually provide far clearer anatomical information that we can look at and interpret. Now, remember, the fossil record, our interpretations, the historical reconstructions we do on the fossil record is only going to be as good or strong as the empirical, the high confidence data allows it to be. So, for example, in the world of genetics, I've put out several videos recently focusing on the Y chromosome dissimilarity challenge. So the challenge is out there for the evolutionary community to engage, to answer in a sophisticated manner. And so if the direct data, the genetic data, which is the direct way to answer the question of ancestry, if that contradicts our fossil interpretations, or fossils are fickle, they can tell many different stories. And so those reconstructions are only going to be as persuasive as the direct evidence, like we see in the world of genetics, allows them to be. And so the evolutionary community, they have a historical reconstruction that they've done. They have interpretations of the fossil data, as we're going to see here, that I will be interacting with and engaging. But currently, the genetic data contradicts the historical reconstructions. And so that means they're just presupposing their position of ape to man evolution onto the fossil data, okay, as they reconstruct evolutionary history. But those genetic related arguments need to be addressed. And so what I am going to be doing in this series is showing exactly why the genetic data lines up and the fossil data lines up. There's no contradiction. They complement each other. Now, later on today, which is why I want this to be a series, because just on the Australopithecines, I have probably at least 2 hours of material. Now, Matt and I, we are going to be doing our second biblical creation seminar. Our first one, which we did last month, is currently close to 20,000 views. So obviously there's a lot of eyes on it. The critics are paying close attention to what we're putting forth. In that seminar, Matt and I have 2 hours to present, and then we'll probably have roughly another 2 hours of questions and discussion. And my hour, so we each get an hour. My hour, I'll be focusing on multiple issues. One of them is this issue, human evolution, specifically the Australopithecine question. Now, because I have limited time to, in that hour, of course, address the hominin fossil record, I'll be discussing incredible lines of evidence for young Earth creation, refuting the critics. I'll be touching on a lot. And so what I'll be presenting in that seminar is a condensed version of this entire presentation. And so I wanted to get this out there first because I know critics will at times take our condensed presentations where we don't really have the time allotted to anticipate objections and counters and challenges. And so to the critics out there, take this series. I've basically got everything good to go. I just need to record the series. This is part 1, and we are going to be leaving no stone unturned. And then it'll be out there. I'll see how the critics respond and engage it. I am confident that the bigger picture model that I will be presenting to explain the mosaic nature of a lot of these so-called hominin fossils. Remember, we're focusing on the hominin line. So you have humans and chimps, which are supposedly chimps are our closest cousin on the evolutionary phylogenetic tree of life. And apparently, according to the evolutionary story, we go back about 6 to 7 million years ago to a common ancestor. And then there's a split. Chimpanzees go one way, your pan lineage, and then you obviously have chimpanzees and bonobos. and then you got humans going the other way. Okay, so you got this split. In your human line, you got your hominins, Ardipithecus ramidus, your Australopithecines, right? You've got afarensis, africanus, anamensis, sediba, so on and so forth. Then eventually you get into your Homo genus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, you got Naledi, Homo floresiensis, so on and so forth. So we'll be engaging all of those, but largely focusing on what? Those in the hominin line, okay? And so again, this is going to be a comprehensive series, and I don't see myself altering in many ways the bigger picture explanation that I'm excited for you guys to see. But perhaps depending on how the critics address the challenges and answer my questions, aspects or details of the model might change. And that's always a good thing, because that means we're coming to a better understanding of these origins related issues, and we are refining our positions. Okay. And so I'm excited for you guys to see all of this material. I want a go-to series for you guys. And so again, a couple different positions that are problematic. Okay. What I was saying earlier about the Lucy reconstructed pelvis, it actually lines up. So I don't think it's a good thing. It's not effective. There are effective approaches and then ineffective approaches. I think it's ineffective to focus too much on the reconstructed pelvis of Lucy, because now we have so many other Australopithecine individuals that we can look at. Take Littlefoot, 94% complete from my understanding, highly articulated. The pelvis is very complete. We get a good picture. I got a whole section in this on Littlefoot, as a matter of fact, because I don't want to just focus on one or two Australopithecines. I want to focus on all of them. We want a holistic approach, okay? And then we can come to a consistent explanation for these interesting creatures. And so anyways, we have a good idea as to what these Australopithecines look like. And it just turns out that more complete Australopithecus individuals match up quite nicely to what the reconstructed pelvis looks like. And so focusing too much on an argument that basically says, well, Lucy and the Australopithecines were just quadrupedal apes, and their pelves were reconstructed to look more like a chimp pelvis, and so they're basically just extinct chimp-like creatures. It's not a strong or defensible argument. It won't work against informed critics. And we at Stand for Truth Ministries, we strongly believe in engaging and interacting with critics. That's why we do so many debates, for example, and so many discussions. Matt and I, since the summer, we've engaged in 3 highly comprehensive formal debates, 2 on modern day debate, 1 biblical seminar here with Culture Cats. And so we like to test our arguments because we know how important it is. And so on the other hand, so you've got that position, which I believe is ineffective. We'll show why. And obviously this is not meant to be an attack on anybody. This is simply model building. This is how science works. We want to come to the best possible understanding of these issues, especially related to origins. So on the other hand, you've got some who have suggested that, well, Lucy was just a human. So that camp would recognize that many of the aspects of the Australopithecines, like what we see in the postcranial material, look more like a human than they do to the extant apes, right? Extant apes, you've got chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, and you got the lesser apes. And they've concluded that, well, Lucy is a human. That's also problematic, though. Okay, the anatomy of Lucy in the Australopithecines strongly contradicts that. Lucy herself, Australopithecus afarensis, shows clear differences from both modern apes and modern humans. And we need to take those differences seriously rather than forcing them into either extreme category. We need a more balanced, consistent approach. Okay, another issue is saying that Lucy is human, and I've got a whole section on it in this series. The Australopithecine aspect of this series will probably be 2 parts. Again, I got about 2 hours worth of content. This video will be about an hour. And then the second one, which I'll be recording ASAP, will be about an hour, because I want the critics to have a complete picture of my model explaining the Australopithecine issue. So anyways, another problem with saying Lucy is human is that we have other individuals like Littlefoot, Australopithecus, Prometheus, that in its postcranial material, like the pelvis, looks nearly identical to Lucy. But we have a complete skull, or a nearly complete, at least, skull of Littlefoot, and it's clearly ape, clearly not human. And so if one is going to say that Lucy is human based on the pelvis, but as we're going to see, there are some differences in Lucy versus humans, human pelvises, like the ischium, for example. We're going to get into all those important anatomical details in these videos. And so you'd be forced to then conclude that Littlefoot is human because Littlefoot's pelvis matches very closely to that of Lucy's. So major problem there, which is why we need to take a holistic approach. Okay, so my goal in light of that, setting the foundation for this presentation series, is to offer what I believe is a more consistent, evidence-based, and balanced understanding of the Australopithecines. I've engaged in roughly 104 formal debates with critics and just hundreds of informal interactions with the open mic debate series that we've done, informal discussions that I've done, a lot of them being impromptu. And so I know what the critics are saying. And in studying and preparing for this series and deriving my model and explaining the hominin fossil record, I've probably spent 90% of my time at least studying this issue through those that would disagree with me in the evolutionist camp. And so I've seen what the evolutionists have had to say. I've watched several of Gutsy Gibbons' videos and lectures, for example. And it was actually through one of her specific lecture that I'll get into, where the light bulb went off. And she was talking about how these Australopithecines, how they evolved, their mosaic nature and their upright walking abilities, these bipedal creatures. Okay, we're going to see that yes, they walked upright, but not quite in the same unique manner as humans. We're due to transitional or mosaic environments. We know environment dictates morphology. We're not looking at any real true anatomical novelty, but a lot of morphological adaptation. There's a lot of inbuilt morphological adaptability in these creatures, as a matter of fact, in the entirety of the biological world. And so if you have these transitional mosaic environments after the flood, and environment dictates morphology in many ways, then of course we are going to expect a lot of these mosaic traits in these creatures that are beautifully adapted to climbing, but also to walking upright in woodland and grassland type environments. Okay, so we're going to get into all that, and I'm excited for it. That's why in this examination we are going to see why their mosaic features make much more sense when viewed through a creation framework of variation and adaptation rather than evolutionary transformation. So we're going to get into the details, guys. And before I do, I did want to show you something. This here would be the series that I am referring to, going back a couple years ago now. Dr. Peter Line, who I think is one of the, if not the best in the world of creation at examining the hominin fossil record. And so as you can see here, 3.5 hours, almost 4 hours for part 2, 3 hours for part 3. And we did a seminar this year on out of Africa and again, the hominin fossil record. And that was about 4 hours. So, you know, you're looking at close to it, over a dozen hours on this. And so if you're looking for a consistent, a series addressing from the Cretaceous perspective, the hominin fossil record, including the Australopithecines, one that you can trust, where the arguments will work. And that's why we haven't had any serious counter or rebuttal to this series, because this series takes a very balanced, conservative approach to addressing the hominin fossil record. And so I did want to show that to people. And then I've also got this article, which is for ministry partners currently. But once I'm done this series, I will be making this public for people to enjoy. And that way they'll have what? Well, they'll have a video series and also a detailed article going through all of these points. Okay, guys, we've set the foundation. Introduction out of the way. I really wanted to get those details in, as now I feel much more confident to go over all of this material, because I want you guys to have a good starting foundation for what we are going to be discussing. Now, as I said, evolutionists believe that chimpanzees are our closest cousin on the tree of life. And they would say that in the hominin line after the split is where we would get these so-called transitional forms. And okay, I think we're good to go. Just making sure everything is shared and where I need it. Okay, so what we like to do as creationists oftentimes is attempt to answer the question, what is and what isn't human, by looking at the differences between humans and chimpanzees, which it's good to look at the differences between humans and chimpanzees. Clearly, there are a lot of differences in terms of anatomy, morphology, physiology, and genetics. But the issue is when we want to differentiate humans from apes simply based on isolated differences between humans and chimps, that can put us in a corner or a trap where the evolutionist wants us, because then they're going to point to examples in the fossil record. For example, if you were to say, well, the pelvis between humans and chimps is very different. Well, that is true. But wait a minute, the pelves in the fossil record in these Australopithecines are very human-like as compared to ape-like. Of course, taxonomically, evolutionists are going to call us apes, but for the evolutionists, we can say human apes and non-human apes. That's how they would taxonomically differentiate us from the great apes. And so creationists may point to the pelvis or curved phalanges, because apes have curved fingers, we don't. But wait a minute, in the fossil record, we have humans like Homo floresiensis or Homo naledi, which actually have curved phalanges. So obviously, we can't look to these isolated cases like the phalanges, or even at a superficial level, the pelves. There's all kinds of traits we can look at, cranial, postcranial, that the evolutionists will basically point to in a fossil and say, hey, I got you, because, you know, this non-human or this human actually has that same trait. So how can we differentiate? And that's what we're going to do here in this series. We're going to show major discontinuities that I argue the evolutionary community cannot account for. Okay, so notice this. Before we even look at the Australopithecines, we need to recognize just how different humans and chimpanzees really are. These differences are not minor. They involve nearly every major system in the body: the skull, pelvis, limb proportions, spine, hands, feet, brain size, vocal anatomy, and even deep genetic architecture. Even those in the paleoanthropological community. We'll get into this in more detail. I just wanted to mention this because it's important when we're trying to differentiate humans from non-humans, because we want to take a holistic approach. We don't want to just look at one trait here, one trait there. We want to take everything in its entirety. And when we have enough of the individual, when we have enough of the Australopithecine individual, we can clearly tell if it's a human or an ape, or even those in the Homo genus like Naledi or Floresiensis. But even those in the paleoanthropological community have recognized and stated in the conventional literature that pathological features can actually mimic primitive or basal features. Okay, so that's important to note as we move forward, working to differentiate humans from non-humans. Evolutionists claim that the fossil record, especially the Australopithecines, fills this enormous gap. So now the question becomes, do these fossils really show the step-by-step transformations required to turn a chimp-like creature? Remember, humans, chimps, they go back not to a chimp, but to a common ancestor between humans and chimps, into a human, or do they fall into a separate category altogether? Okay, let's get into the fun. Here's the technical details. On this slide, what we have are three important anatomical references related to Australopithecus afarensis. That would be Lucy. So on the left here, for example, these fossils, fragmented. You got AL 288-1. That would be Lucy's skeletal remains. She belongs to the Afarensis species, but there are other Afarensis individuals. But this is one of the more complete Australopithecine skeletons discovered. Not as complete as Prometheus, though, as we're going to see. And so, though still fragmentary, clearly, as you can tell, but even though Lucy is very fragmentary, because many skeletons or many elements of the skeleton exist in left-right pairs, what researchers can actually do is use symmetry to fill in the gaps. For example, if we have a preserved left arm, well, that can help us to make an appropriate inference into what the right arm looks like. Okay, does that make sense? And you can do the same thing with the skull because of symmetry. And so, as I said, Lucy's not the only Afarensis specimen. We actually have several other individuals that help provide a broader picture of the species' overall anatomy. And so, again, that's why it's ineffective to point to the reconstructed Lucy pelvis and say, well, and we all know that famous video where basically a hacksaw, was taken to it, or an electric saw was taken to it, and you can hear the, and it is kind of a funny video. But truly, Lucy's pelvis was found in an anatomically impossible position. There's really no way that you could manipulate what we found for Lucy's pelvis to look chimp. You're going to see the chimp pelvis is totally different. Different enough to where you could not manipulate Lucy's pelvis fragments to look like a chimp pelvis. But most importantly, again, we've had many more discoveries of Australopithecine individuals where their pelvis, like in Littlefoot, matches very closely to what Lucy's reconstructed pelvis looks like, which means the reconstruction was done relatively well. To those that want to say Lucy is human, and again, this is just constructive criticism, not attacking anyone, just model building. This is how science works. Since Littlefoot matches so closely to Lucy, and Littlefoot, we got the entirety of the skull for the most part. Clearly an ape, clearly not a human, yet its postcranial material basically matches perfectly with Lucy's postcranial material. And so why are we to believe that Littlefoot's skull, which looks like an ape, isn't also roughly what Lucy's skull looked like? It just, there's no good reason or justification to say, well, Lucy's a human, but Littlefoot is not. Because I don't think anyone's going to be saying that Littlefoot is human, because it clearly isn't. Anyways, in the center, we have an Australopithecus afarensis skull cast, which gives us a general idea of the cranial features of the species, such as the brain size, facial projection, okay, more prognathic, where it sticks out more like an ape, and dental structure. We're going to be getting a lot into the dental arcade to try and differentiate between humans and non-humans. In terms of the hip, we'll be looking at the ischium, how in humans, the ischium is short, which is good for functional purposes in terms of how we can efficiently walk upright. Whereas in apes, and for the most part, your Australopithecines, there's a couple interesting examples like sediba. We'll get into that. Once you start digging into the paleoanthropological literature like I have, there's a lot of debate on a lot of these traits, because if they're fragmented or certain measurements as well, how are we best to measure something like the ischium or other features? There's a lot of debate there. But for the most part, what I have discovered is that the long ischium of apes, which means if they walk upright, it's going to be in an inefficient manner. The Australopithecines also had a long ischium, like in Lucy, the Lucy pelvis, for example. And so there are traits we can look at to answer that question. What is human and what isn't? So anyways, when it comes to the skull casts, we'll find individual Australopithecines varying. But for example, you'll find, like with Lucy, it's not like you got the full skull. But when you get enough individual fossils, when you have numerous fossils, then you can put them together and get a good idea what their skull looked like. On the far right is the pelvic reconstruction. And Lucy, although Lucy's pelvis is incomplete and required some reconstruction clearly, paleoanthropologists have been able to compare it to other Australopithecine pelves, like STS-14, that would be Australopithecus africanus, and which we mentioned before, the exceptionally complete, over 94%, I believe it is, pelvis of Littlefoot, which is Australopithecus prometheus. And because we have more than one species and more than one pelvis, researchers, what they can do and what they have done is essentially cross-check anatomical expectations. And that builds a more confident reconstruction than if we only had a single individual or a single specimen, right? Let's say we only had Lucy, and then you see that it was highly reconstructed. That would raise doubt. Is this an accurate or an inaccurate reconstruction? Were there too many evolutionary assumptions or presuppositions going into that reconstruction or not? But because we have many more individuals to compare it to, those individuals having a more complete pelvis, then we can answer the question, okay, is this accurate or is this inaccurate? We can pretty confidently say that it is accurate. That's okay. Together, these visuals here show three of the key anatomical areas used to evaluate the locomotion, posture, and overall biology of the Australopithecines. Because remember, a major question we'll be answering in this series is, did the Australopithecines walk upright? And if they did they walk upright in an efficient manner or inefficient manner? You know, what was it? Okay, upward, that they were bipedal, but it was more like a bent knee, bent hip, kind of inefficient type bipedality. Or was it very similar, if not identical, to us as humans today? Or are humans unique in the way that we walk upright? And so we'll be evaluating those questions in upcoming slides. We'll be taking a closer look at how these features are interpreted and what the broader evidence suggests. Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy. Here's some key points, and I mentioned a few so far. So long ape-like ischium in the pelvis, not human, optimized for climbing, bent hip, bent knee type of walk. We got the highly flared ilia, okay, the extreme lateral flare outside human range. And again, we got to be careful with that as well, because we actually see that pathology, inbreeding, disease, fixation, environment can actually result in humans some lateral flare, like we see in Hobbit, and I think even Naledi. Okay. But again, this is why we take a holistic approach. We don't just look at one trait and make a conclusion, a dogmatic conclusion. We look at everything in its entirety. Brain size, very small, 400 to 500 cc, full ape range. Strongly prognathic face and U-shaped dental arcade. Clearly ape, not human. We don't want to confuse dental arcade and mandible, okay? Because as we're going to see, the dental arcade is more U-shaped, where the human is parabolic or V-shaped. We're going to make some interesting comparisons. And then the hyoid bone, the old hyoid bone. I've been making the challenge to evolutionists and all these debates that we've been doing. Show me a hyoid bone that's designed and built for human speech, sophisticated language, okay? Because that is highly dependent on the hyoid bone. And the only known, as we're going to see, Australopithecus hyoid bone is ape-like. Matches extant apes. Obviously, the Australopithecines were not speaking like we do today. They did not have sophisticated language. So therefore, the evolutionary community, to explain this discontinuity, is going to have to show empirically when, where, why, and how we go from an ape-like hyoid bone, not designed or built for sophisticated language and speech, with intermediate stages, to the hyoid bone that we see today in humans that is built and designed for sophisticated speech and language, where we can take those creative thoughts that we have and express them verbally and outwardly and engage in these kinds of conversations. So hyoid bone, we're inferring because we have a single hyoid from an Australopithecus individual. And so we're inferring that the Australopithecines then, including Lucy, had that ape-like bulla for air sacs, zero evidence of speech transition. And so here is a visual, a slide that I got from one of Gutsy Gibbons' lectures on the topic. Excellent lecture. Again, credit where credit is due. I learned a ton, and it really helped me to refine my position and understanding in terms of these Australopithecines and the hominin fossil record in general. And so here is a visual from it. There's the source, a brief history of what we are and how we got here, featuring Gutsy Gibbon. And I do want to be as detailed and comprehensive as possible in this series, answering this question, which is why I got this visual up here. And so she is going to focus on, and has focused on, the anterior foramen magnum, basically to identify a bipedal creature. The valgus knee, bowl-shaped pelvis, sagittally oriented ilia, three-arched foot, inline hallux, that's the big toe, okay? And so she is going to say, well, Ardipithecus ramidus, for example, had only a couple of these traits, but the further you move up in the evolutionary timeline, these ape-like creatures, these extinct primates, get more and more of these features, like Lucy and Littlefoot and Sediba had all of these basically, which means they must have been upright. The foramen magnum, for example, is one of them. The big hole, right? You can see the difference between the human and the Australopithecus. Now, the Australopithecus foramen magnum is not in the same position as humans, but it's also not in the same position as chimpanzees. Isn't that interesting? The foramen magnum, the hole where the spinal cord enters the skull, reveals posture and locomotion. We can get a lot, we can understand a lot in terms of the posture and locomotion of creatures, including extinct creatures, through fossils based on the positioning of the foramen magnum. In humans, it sits far forward, right? You can see that here a lot more. Let's see right here, a lot more forward, supporting our fully upright bipedal stance. In Australopithecines, it is only slightly forward of chimpanzees and nowhere near the human position, which is why they would say, well, it's intermediate, right? It's moving towards the position that we see today in humans. But you will see evolutionists overstate their case and say, yeah, foramen magnum, just like we see in humans. Well, no, not quite, is the point. And why this is important as I go over the mosaic nature, because you'll see a lot of evolutionists, paleoanthropologists, and primatologists like Erica. They'll say, well, it's not that you just have this bone that's more derived or this bone that's more basal or primitive. No, it's within the same structure. Let's take the pelvis, okay, which has multiple parts to it, of course. You'll have one aspect of the pelvis that's more human-like or derived, and another one that's more basal or primitive. So that's why the pelvis in general is both more human-like and then more primitive or ape-like, and therefore mosaic. And they'll say the same thing about the cranium, the cranial material, the postcranial material, okay, which obviously the pelvis is situated in. And so we are going to offer a superior explanation for the mosaic nature of these individuals. This demonstrates that Australopithecines were not intermediate, but maintained an ape-like head, neck posture, and cranial base anatomy. It does tell us that they did walk upright, but once we consider everything in its entirety, we're going to see that they did not walk upright quite like we do. And we as creationists, we shouldn't fear upright walking creatures, because there are bipedal creatures. I mean, gibbons walk upright quite well. Birds, some theropod dinosaurs, for example. Okay. And so we should not look to bipedality or upright walking as being a trait that helps define what it means to be made in the image of God. Okay, I want to make that clear. We should not fear upright walking creatures other than humans. All sorts of creatures in the biological world were built and designed with two legs. And so it might actually be odd to think that humans are the only ones that use those two legs to walk upright. That's kind of odd to think about. So I do want to take a good objective look at all of these different features. Okay. So one could say that the anatomical discontinuity between Australopithecines and Homo supports separate origins rather than evolutionary transition. But this isn't enough for that, because they're going to say that the foramen magnum, the big hole, is in a position that's intermediate between humans and chimpanzees. And so over time, it's moving to where it needs to be. They would actually say, of course, the foramen magnum is not going to be in the exact same position as humans today, because this is going back 2 to 4 million years ago. And so obviously it's going to migrate more and more over time, hence intermediate. Australopithecines exhibit a slight anterior shift of the foramen magnum compared to chimpanzees, but their overall cranial base morphology remains fundamentally ape-like and does not approach the fully anterior human-like condition. Again, a lot of this is going to be agnostic or non-differentiating anyways to the overall debate, because they're going to say that, well, this is what we would expect, because this is an intermediate creature, which means a lot of the features will be intermediate in their nature. Okay, and not fully at what we would see a human at. The valgus knee, she points to. The valgus knee refers to the inward angling of the femur that brings the knees closer to the midline. You can actually see that in Erica's picture here with the comparison of the human and the gorilla, where it's more vertical, and then the valgus angle on the human is angled out. So obviously with the human is going to have more efficient upright walking than your gorilla. Okay. Humans use this. Well, I want to focus on this again. The valgus knee refers to the inward angling of the femur that brings the knees closer to the midline. Okay. Humans use this configuration to keep the feet under the body during upright walking. So proponents of evolution often point to the valgus angle in Australopithecines, which is more similar to humans, such as Lucy, as evidence of habitual bipedalism. However, a valgus angle is not uniquely human. Various climbing and arboreal primates show similar angling, not saying exact. There's variation, similar angling for vertical climbing and maneuvering. In Australopithecines, the knee must be considered with the rest of the locomotor anatomy. Again, going back to the same point, and we're going to bring it all home and land the plane by the end of this presentation, the two-part presentation on the Australopithecines at least. We want to take a holistic approach and look at everything and consider everything, not just one isolated trait here, another isolated trait here, but everything. In Australopithecines, the knee must be considered with the rest of the locomotor anatomy, which still includes many non-bipedal traits in the pelvis, spine, ankle, and foot. The reported angle in these fossils is also debated, often falling within or only slightly above the ape-like range. Taken together, the valgus knee suggests some upright capability, but does not demonstrate human-like, fully committed bipedalism. And again, you can see gibbons today. You can watch videos, look at pictures. They are really good at walking upright. It almost looks like a little hairy human. And Gutsy Gibbon has explained, and many other paleoanthropologists in their lectures have pointed out, that how did bipedalism in apes or primates come about? Because obviously bipedalism in the animal kingdom, in the biological world, is more of an exception rather than a rule. From the evolutionary model, one might ask the question, well, why didn't more? Because it's very helpful to walk upright. Why didn't more creatures evolve that ability? Why wasn't that ability selected for more often? And what you see is change in environments, and evolutionists might say, well, you'd have a creature that spends more time in trees and actually hangs out in the trees in an upright fashion, maybe hanging from the branch like that. And so, they're hanging in an upright manner. or simply standing or moving around in an upright manner. And so what happens when you take away the trees? What happens when you take away that environment is you have shifts in environment, less trees and more grasslands or woodland kind of environment. Well, then you have a creature that spent a lot of time in an upright manner in the tree, adapt to an upright walking lifestyle on land, which can be beneficial and helpful in many ways. And so a mosaic environment leads to mosaic morphologies, where you have a creature like an Australopithecine that is well adapted and well suited for an arboreal lifestyle and a lifestyle on the ground, walking in an upright manner. And again, this is all morphological adaptability, though. That's what's interesting. No real true anatomical novelty. Okay. So now we're getting into Littlefoot, Australopithecus Prometheus. Again, as I said, very complete, highly articulated. Clearly, that skull is not human. Okay. Highly prognathic. And you can see the snout sticking out. You can see not a very big forehead, heavy brow ridges. And the pelvis, difficult to find the size of the ischium, but piecing everything together in the paleoanthropological literature seems to suggest that the ischium in Littlefoot is also quite long. The arms are long as well, you can tell. But again, we have a good idea what these Australopithecines look like. And when you compare Littlefoot with Lucy, they're very similar, which means one can logically extrapolate or consistently extrapolate Lucy's skull to look pretty close to what Littlefoot's skull looks like, which is clearly an ape, a non-human ape. And so if you're going to say based on much of the postcranial material like the pelvis that Lucy is human, then are you going to say that Littlefoot is also human? Because I'm not sure anybody, evolutionist or creationist, is ready to claim that this is a human. Australopithecus Prometheus, 94% complete, gives us a great picture as to what these Australopithecines look like. STW 573. Key points. Nearly identical pelvic pattern to Lucy. Confirms Lucy is representative, not transitional. Long ape-like ischium. What that means, representative, is we have these creatures, these kinds of creatures like the Australopithecines. They were mosaic in many ways. Okay. They were different from both extant apes and different from humans. And so what do we do with them? Evolutionists are saying that they're intermediate, that they're transitional. Okay. We understand environment can dictate morphology. We understand that we have shifts in environment in both the creation and evolution models, because in the creation model, we have the pre-flood world, which is 95% green, which is lush. You have much vegetation, massive trees, and you could have these pre-flood ape-like primate creatures existing in trees, being well adapted to arboreal lifestyles. Okay. But still with that front-loaded adaptability, where if they move into new environments, their morphology can shift in minor ways based on environmental stimuli or stressors. And so you get the immediate post-flood world, the real estate is greatly altered. The environments rapidly shift in chaotic ways. And you have an immediate post-flood ice age. This is everything in a nutshell, but an immediate post-flood ice age. And then you have shifts in environment to more, we have these creatures existing in grassland environments. And so now their morphology can shift in ways where we see mosaic traits, not necessarily related to evolution or these being transitional forms, but being mosaic because the environment and the rapid shifts in environment post-flood and post-flood ice age actually have acted upon these various morphological traits with the diversity built in. And I'm just talking about minor shifts, okay? It's not like these Australopithecines in the pre-flood world looked like extant apes today. Now, different kinds altogether. I'm just saying the traits within these features or within the anatomy, like the pelvis, you can get these minor shifts where it kind of takes on more of a mosaic look, but because that is demanded by the shifts in environment. And epigenetics obviously would have a part to play as well. And so long ape-like ischium documented, from what I can tell, in high resolution reconstructions. The skull, fully ape, obviously prognathic, small brain, 408 cc's, no movement toward homo. Locomotion, capable of upright walking, but not human-like, mixed climbing, and terrestrial. So far, what I've presented, one could argue is largely agnostic. Evolutionists are saying that this is evidence of these creatures being intermediate or transitional. I am saying no, these are separate creatures. They existed in post-flood environmental conditions that were mosaic or transitional. These environments were transitioning from one state to another rapidly. And since environment affects the morphology of these creatures, you can have minor shifts in the morphology to where someone can look at the anatomy and they can make conclusions that say, well, see this pelvis, this trait or this feature is more, as they would say, derived, or this one here is more basal or primitive ape-like. Okay. So what's going to break the agnostic nature of these interpretations, creation, evolution, are the discontinuities that we see in the ischium, the discontinuities that we see in the hyoid bone. Okay. The discontinuities that we see in the skull. These discontinuities that put the Australopithecines in their own group, in their own category, separate from extant apes and separate from extant humans and extinct humans like Homo naledi, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo erectus. And we're going to be discussing that in more detail as we move on in this presentation. So as I said earlier, there are many more Australopithecine species according to the evolutionists. We've got africanus, that's STS 14. Key points: brain size still in ape range, cranial base and facial projection unmistakably ape-like. Pelvis shares same Australopith blueprint, flared ilia, long ischium. So my challenge would be this. And again, I'm open-minded on this one. The hyoid is a major challenge for the evolutionists. But I am curious because I know there is some debate on the ischium of sediba. And we're going to get into that, and I'm looking forward to some back and forth discussion and interaction on that issue. But if humans have a short ischium, which helps for more efficient upright walking, it's what you'd expect in a full-time bipedal creature like a human. Fascinatingly, we find short ischiums, just to make sure I said a short ischium in humans, but amazingly, we find a short ischium in Naledi. We find a short ischium in Hobbit. And that's fully consistent with them being human, as we said. And then in your Australopithecines, Lucy, we find a long ischium. In your other Australopithecines, we find long ischiums. Sediba, what I can see, and I've got some slides on this that we'll touch on probably in the second episode, but they do say that the ischium in Sediba is shortened. That seems to be contextual, shortened compared to other Australopithecines, but still long compared to humans. And so it doesn't quite go or overlap with human variation in the ischium. But we'll discuss that in more detail. The transition to afarensis is not supported. We're going to see the overlap of all these different creatures because you'll find evolutionists, proponents of ape-to-man evolution. They'll say, oh, we got this series from Ardipithecus to afarensis up to habilis up to erectus. So this chain, okay, where they say from more primitive to more derived, from more non-human ape-like to human ape. But we're going to show that there's actually a lot of overlap, and that doesn't necessarily work. And so sediba, I think a good place to stop for now would be sediba, because we are going to have to take a considerable time on sediba. before I wrap up this first part, I do want to show you something else real quick. So in this article here, which most at least of the details in this I have in the PowerPoint here. And so, like I said, we'll be stopping at sediba because sediba is a big question, and we'll be treating it as a legit species, but also going over some of the reasons why some believe it is an artificial taxon. Ella Bean, Yoel Rat come to mind. And so we'll be dealing with sediba. We'll be getting into transitional environments. We'll be getting into the superior model, dealing with RD, the overlap, dental arcade. So stay tuned. Lots to look forward to. We're about at the hour mark. And like I said, I got about 2 hours worth of content. So I think this is a good place to wrap it up and also preserve my energy for a lengthy but fun seminar later today. The Australopithecine pelvis is often presented as human-like, yet its detailed anatomy reveals a form of bipedalism. Let's not deny that these creatures at least had a form of bipedalism. In my opinion, the debate should be composed of the question, what kind of bipedalism? Was it an inefficient kind? Was it an efficient like humans? These kinds of questions, okay? Iliac flare, extremely lateral, gluteal muscles oriented for side sway balance, not efficient forward stride. The ischium, which we talked about, long and posterior, excellent for climbing, poor for upright locomotion. And of course, like I said, we've got major challenges, major discontinuities that I want to see answered, like what we see in the hyoid. Okay. Two, that I'm interested in some engagement and I'm willing to change my mind and alter my position on, because there's a lot of debate and a lot of information in the paleoanthropological literature. And I've gone through a lot of it to make these conclusions. And I'm still torn a bit on the ischium. From what I'm seeing in Littlefoot, seems to be long. Sediba, again, there's some debate. There's also a lot of debate on how to measure it and how to come to these conclusions, okay? But sediba does seem to be shortened, but I believe that is in relation to other Australopithecines, but still not reaching what we see in humans. And the dental arcade is an interesting one, which we're going to be spending a lot of time in part 2. Sacrum, narrow and less curved. Inefficient for weight transfer and habitual upright posture. There's many reasons why I don't believe the Australopithecines existed in a form of locomotion, upright walking habitually. Acetabulum, more lateral than in humans, consistent with arboreal mobility, adapted for both. Mosaic environments, transitional environments, because environments dictate morphology. Epigenetics has a lot to play in this. Okay, then I'm not surprised that some of the anatomy of these Australopithecines have a mosaic nature to them. Even evolutionary anatomists like Owen Lovejoy have described Australopithecines walking as inefficient. It was not human walking. It was a different gait entirely. Here's the point that I really wanted to emphasize. I talked about this in the presentation. Modern gibbons walk bipedally on the ground more efficiently than chimps do, yet no one calls them transitional. One reason why the evolutionists wouldn't call them transitional is because, okay, there are other creatures that have a form of bipedalism, but they're looking at the Australopithecines and their bipedal nature, but they're also looking at the traits themselves, like the pelvis, for example, or the valgus knee, or the foramen magnum, or the teeth, okay, the jaw, just looking at all these different features and saying, see, these are mosaic, these are intermediate. Where they probably wouldn't say the same thing about a gibbon. My point is, there are other upright walking creatures. So as creationists, we should not say that walking upright is an aspect of being made in the image of God. Okay. Epigenetics, environment, and adaptation. Traits like smaller teeth or lighter jaws in Australopithecines are often cited as human-like, but they can be easily explained through environmental and epigenetic plasticity. not evolutionary innovation. Dietary variation, for example, soft fruits versus tough vegetation, can alter enamel thickness and jaw structure, just like we see in these Australopithecines. Epigenetic regulation allows developmental genes to adjust bone morphology based on diet, stress, or climate. Such changes can arise within a few generations. Remember, this is rapid morphological adaptability. It's built in. That's why it can happen rapidly. Okay, but this isn't any true anatomical novelty. So this could never be viewed as hyperevolution, especially if the variations are just minor. Where these Australopithecines in the pre-flood world and those coming onto the ark, God bringing heterozygous pairs, these creatures being in a state of DNA diversity, still looking largely the same as their pre-flood counterparts, but with some minor variations occurring due to the rapid shifts in environments that give this mosaic-like appearance. So minor cranial differences between Australopithecines and other apes do not represent evolutionary transitions. They reflect micro-level adaptation built into the design of created kinds. Okay, there's a lot here, and my goal isn't to go through all of this. I wanted to briefly address this question with Lucy and whether or not Lucy was human. And I went over some problems. Why I have to address all these different models is to show you that the model I am offering in this series is the most balanced, consistent, and I would argue irrefutable creationist position in addressing the Australopithecines. So some have argued that Lucy's pelvis must indicate she was a small-bodied human, essentially a pygmy rather than an ape. However, the discovery of Littlefoot, which we covered a little bit here in this talk, STW 573, makes that interpretation untenable. Littlefoot's pelvis shares the same flared iliac blades, short sacrum, and narrow inlet as Lucy's. Yet Littlefoot's skull, brain size, right, 488 cc's, dentition, and prognathic face are unmistakably ape-like. That's why I said when you actually have the entirety of these creatures and these individuals and not just looking at a single trait, like, oh, curved phalanges, so that must mean it's an ape. Well, no, not necessarily. Oh, the hip superficially looks more human than ape, so it must be a human. No, we need enough of the material to actually make that judgment, to make that conclusion. When we have enough of it, like we have with Littlefoot, it's unmistakably not a human. And because so much of its postcranial material matches with Lucy's, and Littlefoot's skull is clearly an ape, then we can extrapolate that to mean that Lucy is also an extinct ape-like primate. If Lucy were reclassified as a human based on pelvic form, consistency would demand the same for Littlefoot, and by extension, all Australopithecines, despite their clear non-human cranial and postcranial anatomy. The simplest, most coherent explanation is that these similarities in the hip reflect a shared Australopithecine design optimized for mixed locomotion, not evidence of miniature humans. Since proponents of the pygmy human viewpoint might look to Homo naledi and Homo floresiensis for support, it's important to, and again, if Lucy had a long ischium, but all humans have a short ischium, including Naledi and Hobbit, well, then those that would argue that, and there's one individual that's been commenting, See Science Film Labs, good to see ya. He's been commenting in some of my videos because he holds to this view, and he's still adamant that, you know, Lucy is a mix of some kind, leaning human. But if the pelvis is human, but yet the ischium is long, just one of the features, show me a human that has a long ischium. In stark contrast, all Australopithecines, which include Lucy and Littlefoot, retain the long, posteriorly oriented ischium characteristic of climbing apes. This single trait sharply distinguishes Australopithecus from humans and decisively refutes the claim that Lucy was a small-bodied human. It is true that certain post-flood human populations, such as Homo naledi and Homo floresiensis, exhibit some degree of iliac flaring. However, this flare remains well within the broad but definitively human range. In contrast, the Australopithecine ilium flares dramatically outward to a degree unmatched in any human, modern or fossil. Even if it matched that of Hobbit, it wouldn't even matter, because Hobbit, we have so much material for that we can tell Hobbit is human, suffered island dwarfism. There's other creatures on that island of Flores, that suffered the same kind of dwarfism, like elephants. So that's an easy case. Reductive evolution. Okay. Smaller brains too. I mean, brains are energetically costly, and so selection could actually favor, in the right environment, smaller brains, where on an island you're not going to be, it's going to be more difficult for food and resources and drink and so on, and nutrition. And so it wouldn't take long, just a few generations, for the brain to shrink. Okay. Because they're so energetically costly. So anyways, we have so much of Hobbit to tell it's human, that even if we have, let's say, Hobbit or Naledi, where it's got curved fingers or a flared iliac blade, when it comes to Lucy and Littlefoot, we have so much of Littlefoot and enough of Lucy to tell no, even with the iliac flare, even with the curved fingers, with the pelvis that has some attributes very similar to humans, they're not human. Okay. We got to take a holistic approach, is my entire point. And so, okay, let's go back to these slides. And what we have for part 2 is we'll be focusing a lot on sediba. We'll be focusing on the transitional environments that these Australopithecines lived in. For example, Australopithecines lived in mixed woodland savanna ecosystems, often dominated by open grassland. See these shifts after the flood, after the post-flood ice age? These habitats naturally encourage more upright posture and ground travel. That would make sense. And it would make sense that, based on the pre-existing ability to adapt, the incredible morphological adaptability built into each kind, these shifts in environment would allow a creature that spends a lot of time in the trees to now shift where they can spend a lot of times in the trees, but you remove a lot of the trees, so now they're forced to spend a lot of the time on the ground. But because of their design being different from extant apes, that design is suitable, or allows them to walk upright, as these habitats are naturally encouraging a more upright posture. And over time, since environment acts upon morphology, you get minor shifts in the pelvis, for example, or the diet allows for minor shifts in the teeth and the skull, where now you have a mosaic-like appearance, but not because of evolution, but because they are existing in mosaic environments, which the creation model interprets as post-flood environmental pressure acting on front-loaded flexibility within the created ape kinds. This explains mild shifts in pelvic shape without any evolutionary transformation, and remains fully consistent with the fossil evidence. Guys, I am pumped for part 2 of this, because we got some questions for the evolutionists, and we are going to be digging deep into the so-called linear progression from a creature like Ardipithecus to the Australopithecines to Homo habilis to Homo erectus and eventually Homo sapiens. And we're going to be dealing even more with sediba and also Homo habilis. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this. Stay tuned for episode 2, and we'll see you later tonight for the second part of our biblical creation seminar. God bless you all. Stand for Truth is signing off.